Well, the second scripture that Debbie read is one of my least favorite. It has a man bringing his son to Jesus, and his son is suffering epilepsy that is putting him in the way of harm. And the man says, "Yeah, Jesus, I brought my son to your disciples, and they weren't able to do anything." And Jesus turns, I take it, to his disciples, which would be me, which would be you. And he says, "Haven't you gotten it right yet? Can't you do this?" And I'm thinking, yeah, I don't know how to do that. Bring that kind of healing. And then Jesus heals the young man of his epilepsy. And then he turns back to his disciples, or his disciples come to him a little later on. And they asked him, "How come we couldn't do that, Jesus?" And Jesus says, "If you had faith as small as a mustard seed, you'd be able to move a mountain." You know, I don't move mountains. And that's the part I've been hung up on for a long time. You know, think of some of the mountains in your own life that you face. It could be relationship difficulties. It could be you have with a family member or someone a long-standing grudge. It could be you have obstacles at work that have just grown and grown and look like huge mountains. It might be you're experiencing some health difficulties that look more and more like mountains all the time. But over the last couple months, I've looked at that passage in a different way. Jesus says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, all of a sudden I started to see that as a statement of hope. I qualify. I have a very small faith at times. Sometimes it's very little. And Jesus is saying, if you have faith that's even small, just tiny, that's enough. That's enough. Trust in God with just that little bit of faith and see what might happen. It will be as if mountains can move. Now, when you're heading towards a mountain, when you first see it, you wonder, even if you're on a road that you know is going to go over the mountain, you can't see it from where you are, and you wonder, how in the world am I going to get over and through that mountain? Sometimes, but when we look at a mountain with a small measure of faith, what begins to happen is that the earliest human beings, when they sought to move through mountains, they found the paths that were already there, created by the wildlife in that area. The wildlife had already found the ridges that were walkable, the ways down into the valleys. And it were those routes that the Native Americans used to traverse the mountains. That when we turn to God with trust, sometimes what we're given is the eyes to see the natural way through the mountains that God has already provided. Now, sometimes those animal trails have turned into the roads that we travel, with a little bit of help from those around us. using our own mind and others using their minds. It becomes a partnership with God that we can find our way through the mountains. And so one of the things that intrigued me about Grant's blasting safety tips and the explosives engineering guide that is in it is that it gives a formula for blowing up mountains. That at times, it takes teamwork. God is saying, okay, what are you going to put into this? I'm willing to help you, but you need to also put in your own self, your own intellect, and make use of those around you to make it through. And so they have calculations on how to blow something up. HF equals HO times dB squared over dB squared minus DE squared. Yeah. Or NE equals HF times 12 over LE. Yeah. That God has given us amazing minds and amazing ways to help remove some of the obstacles that are in front of us. And it can be that mustard seed of faith that breeds just a little bit of hope that helps us to keep working at it and working at it until we make it through or over the mountain. And then there are times when it seems as if God does move a mountain. One of the things that I find interesting hiking down in Hocking Hills, going through the Old Man Cave section, is that there's a place there where the cliff has fallen in. And I can't remember the actual date, but it has it on a sign. On the night of, let's say, July 3rd, 1976, this wall fell in. And I'm glad I wasn't there. But God rearranges geography all the time through volcanoes and earthquakes. It happens in our lives too. That mountains we thought were too high, too deep, God has found a way to move them, and we can make it through. And sometimes what the feed of faith allows us to do is to help us learn how to live in the mountains that we're given. Particularly those of us who are getting older, realize some of the low hills that we're experiencing, some of the mountains we're getting into, we're never going to get out of. That's just part of life. And what having that little seed, that mustard seed of faith does is helps us come to terms that with God's strength, we can live in the mountains of where we are. I've been in Findlay a few years now, and one of the things I've come to love is in the wintertime, the book of the year that we read as a community. And this year that book is Still Alice, A Woman's Journey in Alzheimer's. And for Alice, who was a professor at Harvard, Alzheimer's was her new mountain. It began as foothills, but it turned into a mountain. And one of her first realizations that something was really wrong was when she was walking from her office in Harvard and walked into Harvard Square on her way home. And she got into Harvard Square, and she's in her 50s, early 50s. And all of a sudden, every street looks different yet familiar, and she doesn't know how to get home. doesn't know how to get home. She and her husband tried to use their intellect and the intellect of humankind to fight off the disease. And so they were on special drugs to see how that would help. But it didn't help. And for her, and she did not use this language, but for her it was when that little seed of faith helped her begin to live with the reality of staying in the mountain of Alzheimer's that made the difference. And a daughter who was once estranged finally found a mother who was vulnerable, who she could come alongside of and love and care for in those final years. And in the midst of the mountain, there was a great sense of peace and love. Just a little seed. A seed of faith can help us look at mountains entirely differently and even learn to live in those mountains that will never go away, but we'll find that God is right there, helping us live in that mountain.